San Francisco, from primitive settlement to prosperous jewel of the West. The truth about what was next in the real West.
In a past that is now lost forever, there was a time when the land was sacred and the ancient ones were as one with it. A time when only the children of the Great Spirit were here to light their fires in these places with no boundaries. When the forest were as thick as the fur of the winter bear. When a warrior could walk from horizon to horizon on the backs of the buffalo. When the deserts were in bloom and the streams pure as freshly fallen snow. In that time when there were only simple ways, I saw with my heart the conflicts to come. And whether it was to be for good or bad, what was certain was that there would be change.
The adventurous spirit of early San Francisco symbolized the character of the Old West. Isolated from the rest of the United States by great expanses of untamed land, California was deemed by most Easterners as an uncharted wilderness, suitable only for the most rugged explorer. But a monumental discovery in the region soon transformed San Francisco from a sleepy trading village into the most powerful city on the West Coast. The lure of untold riches attracted adventurers worldwide, creating a unique melding of ideas and imagination that turned a hilly, windswept land by the bay into one of the most influential cities in the Old West.
If California ever becomes a prosperous country, this bay will be the center of its prosperity. Richard Henry Dana, 1836.
San Francisco began as a small, muddy village which would soon become the thriving center of the Pacific Northwest. With the discovery of gold in 1848, thousands of pioneers from all around the world descended upon the region, bringing with them dreams, ambitions, and visions of grandeur.
San Francisco was the metropolis of the West. There was no other city with which it shared its commercial and financial and industrial dominance of the region.
San Francisco's early settlers possessed a resilient, restless spirit, which enabled them to risk everything in hopes of achieving the true American dream. They built a city which reflected their own diversity and strength, a city which less than 60 years later would survive one of the world's great catastrophes. Before the arrival of the first European settlers, the region was inhabited by the Ohlone Indians, a peaceful nation of over 40 sedentary tribes.
The native people who were here, perhaps as many as 10,000, were traveling across that great bay in their tule canoes, gathering, harvesting the abundance of the sea. The hills were covered with shoulder-length bunch grass. There were herds of elk and black-tailed deer. The bay was teeming with wildlife. They really lived in a very abundant land. It was a very good life for them.
But the tranquil lives of these Native American coast dwellers would dramatically change upon the arrival of the first European settlers. In 1769, a Spanish military religious expedition was commissioned to establish settlements in Northern California. What they found was one of the finest natural harbors anywhere in the New World.
It's hard to imagine anyone coming up over the ridge from the coast and seeing the bay laid out in front of them and not being in awe of it.
It is a very large and fine harbor, such that not only all the navy of our most Catholic Majesty, but those of all Europe could take shelter in it. Father Crespi, 1769.
By 1776, the Spanish had decided to solidify their claim to the area. They built Mission Dolores, the sixth in a chain of missions that ran the length of the California coast, as well as a nearby military outpost, or Presidio.
The military post fulfilled their objective of preventing other European powers from establishing a presence in the area. But the military post also served the purpose of making sure that the converts stayed at the mission, because it turned out that most of the Indians in this area did not break down the doors of the mission to be converted.
But the European presence had unforeseen effects on the natives. Diseases previously unknown in the New World were introduced with dire consequences.
Disease hurt them very badly. There were no pogroms or purges or massacres, nothing like that. But the diseases that came in with the Spaniards decimated the Indians.
Despite the hardships of living in a remote land, the Spanish settlers continued to maintain a presence by the bay.
By the 1820s and 1830s, there were really three distinct communities in what's now San Francisco. One was still the military outpost of the Presidio. Another was the mission, or what was left of the mission by that point. And then the third was the village of Yerba Buena, which was located near the bay.
Yerba Buena was a small, largely English-speaking settlement here in this Spanish colony of California initially.
It was typical of the commercial trading outposts that you would have found in other parts of the Pacific Basin at the time.
The Port of San Francisco is a marvel of nature and may be called the Port of Ports. Father Pedro Font, 1776.
If California ever becomes a prosperous country, this bay will be the center of its prosperity. The abundance of wood and water, the extreme fertility of its shores, the excellence of its climate, which is as near as being perfect as any in the world. Richard Henry Dana, 1836.
If I could fall asleep right now, I'd get 6 good hours. I could still get 4 hours. 4 hours is okay. I've done without sleep before. Oh, I can do it again.
If you can't sleep, if things you've tried leave you groggy the next day, your doctor has a breakthrough approach to sleep therapy you should know about. Sleep Solutions from Searle.
American Express Small Business Services. How can I help you?
How can I help you?
Right. We only work with small businesses.
Why don't we start with your cash flow?
And our equipment financing plan will help spread out the payments.
That'll definitely give you more flexibility.
How about setting up a line of credit?
We can do that.
Then I'll put you in touch with one of our CPAs so you can start getting ready for tax time.
We can always make adjustments when your situation changes.
Call 1-800-SUCCESS to find out how American Express Small Business Services can help you do more.
It starts here. It starts here. It also starts here and here. And it all starts right here at Walmart, home of the EverStart battery. All the coal cranking power your truck, car, boat, or more will ever need. Power you can count on when you need it most. And since it's at Walmart, you can also count on a good price. EverStart. The name says it all.
Athlete's foot. It's a predator made up of many types of fungus that eat your feet alive. But there's a potent weapon that doesn't just cure some, it kills them all. Lotrimin AF, the killer cure. Lotrimin AF, the brand doctors recommend most. Full prescription strength medicine. Lotrimin AF is so powerful, it doesn't just kill some causes, it kills them all. Lotrimin AF, the killer cure.
We now return to San Francisco.
In 1846, increasing tensions between the United States and Mexico would force the American government to realize the importance of Northern California. In July of the same year, President James Polk sent Captain John B. Montgomery to take possession of Yerba Buena in the name of the United States. Captain Montgomery appointed one of his best officers, Washington A. Bartlett, as the city's mayor. One of his first actions as mayor was to change the name of Yerba Buena to San Francisco. Less than 2 years after the United States staked its claim to the area, a monumental discovery would turn a small trading post into the preeminent boomtown of the American West. On January 24th, 1848, a 35-year-old carpenter named James Marshall discovered gold on the American River, just northeast of San Francisco.
After shutting off the water from the race, I stepped into it. Near the lower end, and there upon the rock, about 6 inches beneath the water, I discovered the gold. I picked up 1 or 2 pieces and examined them attentively. James Marshall, 1848.
The news of Marshall's discovery spread like wildfire. Prospectors from throughout the world flooded the area, seeking riches beyond their wildest dreams. They arrived in the most well-developed port in the area, San Francisco Bay.
With the discovery of gold, it seemed as though people from all over the world started pouring into California to get rich quick. From Europe, from the eastern United States, from Latin America, from Asia, people came to California, and San Francisco was the entry to the California gold fields.
People began rushing in and the population of the city boomed. As one historian has put it, California was the birthplace of the first instant city. Thousands of tents sprung up on the hills of San Francisco.
Everything changed for San Francisco after the gold rush discovery. The harbor was clogged with ships, loading and unloading passengers.
It was called a forest of masts. There were so many ships run up on shore or just abandoned in the bay that it was, you couldn't come to anchor anywhere near shore after all.
The population exploded with adventurers willing to risk it all for the chance to strike it rich quick, while others faced the reality that they would not be able to have much more than a meager existence in their own country.
Many of the Irish had arrived coming here because of the potato famine in the 1840s, where conditions were atrocious back home, but also attracted to the lure of gold here in California.
The Chinese made arrangements to come over here to look for gold too. It would take them anywhere from a month and a half to 2 months sailing across the ocean to arrive in San Francisco, depending on the wind. Famine, floods, and warlords were the order of the day for a poor country like that, so they would endure anything to earn some money so that they could take care of their family.
The people who came to California during the gold rush, almost by definition, were risk takers. It was a tremendous risk to your health, to your life, to your fortune, to your marriage, to your family back home, to leave all of that and to come out to California.
First, you had to be usually young, 2, energetic, 3, daring, or maybe even reckless, adventuresome, possibly a visionary, or at least maybe just greedy.
But the men that came to seek their wealth in gold were not the only fortune hunters. Many people realized that they were sure to make money by providing much-needed goods and services for men going to the gold mines. Men traveling the motherlode desperately needed tools and provisions for the long, arduous hours they would spend searching for nuggets that were few and far between.
Some of those who made the most money during the gold rush were those who realized that you did much better selling things to miners who found gold than going out and trying to find gold yourself. So not only were there people who wanted to make their fortunes as miners, but there were merchants who came to sell the miners their red shirts, their pans for panning gold, and their picks and shovels and so forth.
One man who parlayed a simple idea into a multi-million-dollar business was Levi Strauss, a German immigrant who, like his fellow merchants, had come to the States in hopes of improving his life.
The men who really made it big in the gold rush were the merchants, the men who came not to mine the gold, but to mine the miners. Levi Strauss was a perfect example of that. He came in to the gold country in the 1850s with a load of canvas, initially intending to sell it for tents, but he soon found a much better use for his canvas, making pants for the miners.
The provisions sought after by miners seemed endless, and everything from jeans to food to additional mining equipment was continually in demand.
Mining equipment manufacturing quickly began in San Francisco, as did food processing, banking. Real estate became more valuable, and overnight the population shot from 150 to 200 to over 2,500 people. So the quiet village of Yerba Buena became a chaotic gold rush settlement. San Francisco, for the first 10 years after the gold rush, was one of the more volatile population centers of the entire country, if not the world.
One of the factors that contributed to the wild quality of early San Francisco was the absence of women. The ratio was something like 9 to 1, 9 men for every woman. This was a source of great instability in the population.
One of the most profound results of this exaggerated competitive behavior between the mostly male population of San Francisco was the formation of the Committee of Vigilance in 1851. The city had boomed so quickly that traditional government structure took a back seat to frontier law.
It was formed in response to a great amount of theft and burglary and robbery in San Francisco. They caught one John Jenkins stealing a safe. And John Jenkins was taken before the Committee of Vigilance. The committee said, "We're about hanging, and hanging John Jenkins is our business." But a young, prosperous merchant, William Tell Coleman, tried to argue that they should wait until the next day so that Jenkins could rise with the sun. Well, he was overruled, and in fact, soon Jenkins was dangling in the moonlight there in the downtown plaza of San Francisco.
William Coleman was a sort of classic exemplar of American male success in the middle of the 19th century. And he was again tapped in 1856 to lead the Vigilance Committee. And one of the goals of the Vigilance Committee in 1856 especially was to reduce the influence of David Broderick, an Irish Catholic political leader of the Democratic Party who had begun his career in New York City and moved to San Francisco in order to take advantage of the lack of barriers to Irish Catholic success in San Francisco.
The vigilantes set out to essentially to clean up all those elements in the town that they blamed for their problems. They banished some people, hanged others.
Although recent actions seem to reflect an attitude of ethnic intolerance in the city, California and San Francisco in particular was much more harmoniously diverse than other parts of the country. As people of different nationalities entered the city, they seemed to naturally gravitate towards their own countrymen. Living among people that spoke their native tongue promoted a sense of security.
San Francisco quickly developed a variety of enclaves. By the end of the 1850s, San Francisco had an extensive Irish Catholic working class district in the south of Market area.
Many of the men who worked in the foundries and machine shops and shipyards were Irish and English.
In North Beach, the Italian sector is best at developing the attributes of the city, the restaurant, theater, music, opera, that kind of life, and the seafood, the fishing fleets were largely Italian. Nob Hill was a ugly, wind-blasted, treeless sand dune of a hill until all these nabobs, or knobs, took it over and put their immense mansions up there.
The waterfront district of San Francisco was famous all over the world for its Wild West character. In fact, the term Shanghaiing, which meant you were kidnapped and taken on board a ship to work on the ship, was invented in San Francisco. It provided a venue for the dealers in illegal or immoral goods and services, opium, hashish, alcohol of all sorts. All could be purchased in the Barbary Coast or along the waterfront.
Even though the waterfront was San Francisco's vital link to the outside world, primitive communication technology was still being relied upon. The introduction of the telegraph in 1861 was of monumental importance to the increased flow of business in the city.
One of the big problems in San Francisco in the mid-19th century was the sense of isolation from the rest of the country. National news was sometimes 4 or 6 months out of date.
So the telegraph made it possible for you, if you were a merchant in San Francisco, to plan your sales strategy and to order goods more quickly and to respond more quickly to ups and downs in the business cycle here on the West Coast.
Businessmen in San Francisco enjoyed a time of great prosperity in the 1850s and 1860s because the city was able to export more goods than it imported.
Not only did the miners spend in San Francisco, thereby creating a service-oriented economy, but San Francisco was also the location of the U.S. Mint, so San Francisco became a banking center for the entire Pacific Coast.
Almost every immigrant group in the city opened a bank. At its peak, the city of San Francisco had over 100 banks.
One of the factors in the success of San Francisco certainly has been the hard-driving ambition of many of the entrepreneurs who have been here, and no man was more ambitious and hard-driving than William Chapman Ralston. He was the founder and president of the Bank of California, which for a time was the largest bank in the West. One of Ralston's greatest contributions to San Francisco was the Great Palace Hotel, the largest structure by far in San Francisco in the late 19th century. It dwarfed the other buildings all around it. It stood 6 stories high, had hundreds of rooms, most of which were never occupied during his lifetime. And it stood there in grand and glorious tribute to not only his ego and ambition, but also to his faith in the future success of San Francisco.
But Ralston's economic success was soon to wane as the Depression of the 1870s hit San Francisco with a vengeance.
At the peak of Ralston's success in 1875, there was a panic and a rush on the Bank of California. The bank was forced to close its doors. He went that day for a swim in the bay, as was his tradition, but on this day, he never came back. His body later washed to shore.
To see his state and city great, prosperous, progressive, conspicuous throughout the world, I think it was this imagination, this ambition that kept hurrying him into one big undertaking after another. Asbury Harpending.
Ask my family which Italian dishes are their favorites. They'd all agree. The Olive Garden's tour of Italy is 3 of the best. Lasagna, chicken parmesan, and fettuccine alfredo. With all the salad and breadsticks you want, just $9.95. The Olive Garden. When you're here, you're family.
How you doing?
I'm still saving money.
How about a call from L.A. to Mexico City? It's $23.80 with AT&T.
It's only $8.80 with 10321.
Impressive.
Just dial 10321, then the number as usual.
I'm speechless.
It's amazing what you can order by phone these days. Most amazing of all, you can buy car insurance direct from Geico over the phone. You could even save 15% or more. And who couldn't use a little extra money around the house? Geico Direct, a better way to buy car insurance.
He could be your father, your husband, your brother, your son. Look back at the generations of warfare with Our Century. Today at 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific, only on the History Channel.
If I could fall asleep right now, I'd get 6 good hours. I could still get 4 hours. 4 hours is okay. I've done without sleep before. Oh, I can do it again.
If you can't sleep, if things you've tried leave you groggy the next day, your doctor has a breakthrough approach to sleep therapy you should know about. Sleep Solutions from Searle.
Own a home and trying to cut the payments on your bills? Call Dytech 1-800-71-FIXED and lower your monthly payments by consolidating your high-interest credit cards with the most competitive rates in the industry. It's the 125 Freedom Loan from Dytech, a no-equity second mortgage for people with good credit that lets you borrow up to 125% of your home's value, tax-deductible in most cases. Get approved over the phone immediately and get out from under your bills. Call Dytech 1-800-71-FIXED for the 125 Freedom Loan today.
Stillness. We thought that we had seen hell.
Tornadoes, volcanoes, hurricanes, avalanches, and all-new Wrath of God. Tonight at 9 Eastern, 10 Pacific on the History Channel.
We now return to San Francisco.
From its modest beginnings, San Francisco experienced unparalleled success in business. Countless dreamers flooded the harbor, creating the fastest-growing boom towns in the West. The city's economic vitality seemed virtually unstoppable. But this boundless success had its limits. Progress in the form of cross-country transportation would end San Francisco's isolation from the markets of the East, exacting a heavy price on the city's merchants. From the discovery of gold until 1870, San Francisco's economy flourished and jobs were plentiful. But in the mid-1870s, an economic depression hit the city. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, linking the far west to the east, seriously affected the insulated business market of the city.
It was the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 that really brought an end to the isolation. At last, goods and passengers could be brought out here relatively easily. During the gold rush, it was 4 to 6 months of life-threatening travel to come into San Francisco from the east. With the Transcontinental Railroad, that was cut down to 6 days.
The city was immediately hit with a challenge in the form of goods made outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. The completion of the railroad meant that merchants outside California flooded the California market with goods, and an economic slump put workers on the unemployment rolls and led business operators to cut wages in California.
Hard times fanned the flames of bigotry as people reached out for someone to blame for their problems.
Lots of people were laid off after the completion of the railroad. The Chinese continued to come into the city at that time. So there was a kind of scapegoating where the unemployed white workers were blaming their Chinese rivals for this national depression. There was the formation of an anti-Chinese political party in the 1870s, centered in San Francisco. It was called the Workingmen's Party, led by an Irish immigrant named Dennis Kearney.
He was a rather unsuccessful small businessman who realized that there was a great deal of discontent in the working class areas of the city. He focused that discontent in 2 directions. One was against the Chinese, the other was against the wealthy. He argued that the Chinese were undercutting wage levels and taking jobs away from white workers. He also argued that it was the wealthy of the city, the railroad owners, the bankers, the manufacturers, who were using Chinese workers in order to accomplish that objective.
While most people were experiencing the frustration of unemployment, a prominent group of businessmen in San Francisco still enjoyed prosperity. Commonly known as the Big Four, C.P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, and Leland Stanford had amassed their fortunes by completing the Central Pacific Railroad to connect with the Union Pacific at Promontory, Utah.
Charles Crocker was physically a very large man. He was as strong as an ox, they said. He was the man who was out there every day seeing to the actual construction of this great transcontinental railroad. In considerable contrast to him was Leland Stanford. He was also physically large, but not particularly strong. He was a ponderous and pretentious sort of a man. Mark Hopkins was the treasurer of the operation, and perhaps was the only one who had something of a good image among the general population. C.P. Huntington was the most powerful man in the inner circle of the Big Four. Huntington stayed behind the scene, but keeping very tightly in his hands the reins of power. He had a policy for pricing on the railroad, which was simply all the traffic will bear. Seeing if they could bear a particular rate, and then quoting them the maximum rate that they could bear, that they would remain in business to ship again the following year. Nob Hill, formerly California Hill, became the site for their residences, and they dominated the city. Mr. Mark Hopkins' home was perhaps the most grotesque. It was crowned with steeples and gables that looked like a kind of medieval castle. People opposed them because they had established a transportation monopoly, not just running a railroad, but the only railroad in town. If you wanted to ship goods on rail, you would talk to Mr. Huntington and his associates.
Though most merchants could do nothing to oppose these financial giants, a man would come to San Francisco to champion the cause of the working man.
Adolph Sutro was a man who had an unusual talent for making money. It seems like everything that he turned to flourished. He was a self-taught mining engineer, born in Prussia, came out to California in the gold rush, went up to the Comstock silver mining area on the Nevada side of the Sierra Nevada.
He experienced his first financial success in the silver mines, where he invented a tunnel that saved the lives of mine workers and allowed the continuation of silver mining.
What he did was dig a tunnel underneath the major mines that drained the water out of them that was collecting and drowning the works. Also flushed out the poisonous gases and also relieved the heat of the mine.
When Sutro finally made close to $1 million from the sale of his tunnel rights in Nevada, he moved to San Francisco. Sutro had also made himself a hero of wage workers when he took on the role of a supporter of the miners who were mining silver in Nevada. And so when he moved to San Francisco, his reputation as a friend to the working man made him a popular figure in San Francisco.
Adolph Sutro then invested in real estate, eventually owning more than 1/12 of the entire real estate in the city limits of San Francisco. And he built there on Seal Rocks a Victorian hotel and restaurant, the Cliff House. Next to that were the Sutro Baths, huge swimming area for the public, 6 great swimming pools to accommodate as many as 10,000 swimmers at one time. Each of the pools at a different temperature from around 50 degrees all the way up to 100 to 110 degrees. 3,000 spectators could sit around watching the bathers swim.
Sutro believed in the kind of entrepreneurial liberty that made the United States famous in the 1800s. So it's not surprising that Sutro, given his hatred of monopoly and his belief in individualism in business, was a strong opponent of the Southern Pacific Railroad.
Sutro was particularly unhappy with the influence of the Southern Pacific Railroad in San Francisco local politics. He ran for mayor in the 1890s on the populist ticket. It was a reform ticket. His slogan was, "The octopus must be destroyed." The octopus a reference to the monopoly of the railroad.
Sutro fought diligently to break the chokehold big business had on the city. But the corrupt practices of the city government became an overwhelming challenge, and Sutro eventually left office after suffering a nervous breakdown.
You're the greatest.
Thanks. Take a check.
Sure, Daffy. Just need some ID.
Are you serious? How many big cartoon stars come into this store?
Checks are a pain, but your bank has a better way, the Visa Check Card. And if your ATM card has a Visa logo on it, you've got one. It automatically deducts from your checking account everywhere Visa's accepted.
You're despicable.
Visa Check Card works just like a check, only better.
Maroon.
Once, in parts of this country, the problem wasn't getting good health care, but getting any at all. Fortunately, the doctors of the American Medical Women's Association have always gone the extra mile for people's health. Now, out of concern for yours, they've granted their acceptance to supplements. These from Nature Made. Nature Made is proud to bring you the first supplements to earn the acceptance of the AMWA. Nature Made, trusted by the ones you trust.
You were mining for gold when it hit, and now you're buried alive, 35 feet below the snow's surface. Over the next 22 hours, you will cry for help and struggle for life. And you will survive. The remarkable account of one man's escape from darkness, plus other stories from the White Wall of Death. Avalanches on an all-new Wrath of God. Tonight at 9 Eastern, 10 Pacific on the History Channel.
Tracing the Celtic past, brilliant artists, yet ruthless warriors. They painted their bodies to intimidate the enemy because fear was their greatest weapon. The search is on for the Celts. Be there as they fight alongside the Knights of Camelot, Vikings, and Samurai during Ancient Warriors Week on In Search of History. All next week at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific, only on the History Channel, where the past comes alive.
We now return to San Francisco.
Like many American cities, San Francisco was able to rebound from the harsh economic times. Much of the city's growth may be attributed to the beauty and the size of San Francisco Bay, which continued to be one of the city's greatest assets. As the 19th century progressed, settlers continued to descend upon the region, and by the late 1800s, San Francisco's population accounted for 1/4 of the entire state of California. As the depressed economic times of the mid-1870s came to an end, once again the city's financial district was beginning to clamor with activity. But the Bay remained San Francisco's greatest source of economic power.
It was the major Pacific port. It was a port through which many of the exports and imports for the whole western region flowed. San Francisco in the late 19th century was a center of a major network of trade up and down the coast, as well as to the East Coast and to Asia. San Francisco in 1890 had more sailors than any other American city, even more than New York City.
Workers were eager to demand better wages and working conditions. The labor unions, which had initially gained notoriety with anti-Chinese sentiment, were now gaining prominence in the political arena.
The pattern of unions in San Francisco, as in the eastern part of the United States, was that unions tended to grow in times of prosperity, because that's the time that employers could most easily meet what they were asked in terms of wages.
But the Chinese never got together and did much in the way of banding together to form unions.
Though they numbered 1/5 of San Francisco's entire population by 1880, the Chinese, by choice and sometimes force, separated themselves from the mainstream of society.
Chinese settlement in San Francisco, from the time of the gold rush, was a segregated and separated settlement.
Chinatown had a kind of aura of being exotic. It was quite separate. It was clearly defined. Chinatown was in many ways a city within a city. It was just a few blocks along Grand Avenue, maybe 6 or 10 city blocks altogether. Within this area, it was very densely populated.
Since they were not welcome in the outside area where to mingle with the other racial groups, they had to make do with anything, and they were sometimes crowded 15 or 20 into a tiny room that's no bigger than our ordinary kitchen.
I myself rarely left Chinatown. Chinese were often attacked by thugs. Once we were inside Chinatown, the thugs didn't bother us. Chinese immigrant.
Much of the Chinese population was male, at times as much as 90%, representing in part immigration patterns from China, and in part the fact that the United States immigration officials purposefully tried to keep out Chinese women. The reason for doing so was probably to prevent the creation of a significant Chinese community within the United States.
The Chinese humbly dealt with sometimes unbearable living conditions, but the anti-Chinese forces in the city were relentless in their harassment.
We must unite all poor and working men to rid the country of cheap Chinese labor as soon as possible by all means in our power. Dennis Kearney, Working Man's Party of California.
The city of San Francisco enacted several ordinances directly against the Chinese. One of these was the infamous breathing space ordinance, which required that every person who was sleeping in San Francisco have at least 500 cubic feet of breathing space. Well, of course, many in Chinatown did not have that much space. They were arrested, taken down to the city jails, crammed into the jails, where the city, of course, was soon violating its own 500 cubic foot breathing space law. A final local ordinance that was directed against the Chinese was the pole ordinance, which prohibited the carrying of goods on poles in San Francisco. It was simply a way of making life difficult for them, encouraging them to leave San Francisco.
Chinatown had its problems internally as well. At one point, crime and violence within the community rose to such a level between warring gang factions that the Chinatown Police Squad was formed by the city to put an end to the situation. Although injustices occurred in early San Francisco, the city had become in every sense a true melting pot. People's choices in occupation, entertainment, and lifestyle varied greatly.
Perhaps it was the isolation of San Francisco from the rest of the country that produced such a flourishing of literature and journalism.
The arts thrived in the city. Theater was a mainstay for many in San Francisco. Actresses like Lotta Crabtree, who got her start in San Francisco, became world famous, earning a fortune of over $4 million.
Not everyone in San Francisco who came in the gold rush was interested in making their fortune legitimately. One of the most notorious bad men of early San Francisco was a character known as Black Bart. He specialized in holding up stagecoaches of the Wells Fargo stage line.
Black Bart's trademark was to leave behind a poem to commemorate his latest crime.
I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor, and for riches. But on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of bitches. Black Bart, the poet.
After his 28th successful stagecoach robbery, Black Bart left behind a handkerchief. The sheriff found it. They traced the laundry mark on that hanky back to a laundry in San Francisco and traced that to one Charles E. Bolton, a local businessman in San Francisco. Now, Mr. Bolton lived right across the street from a San Francisco police station, and he enjoyed going into that police station and visiting with the officers there about the news of the day. And the officers remembered that Mr. Bolton always seemed particularly excited when the conversation turned to Black Bart. Well, Bolton confessed to the crime of robbing the Wells Fargo stage. He was sentenced to some 6 years in San Quentin. He served his term, was released, and what do you think he did? He went out and robbed one more Wells Fargo stage.
The open atmosphere of San Francisco lent itself to a variety of colorful characters. There seemed to be no end to the influx of dreamers eager to find their pot of gold.
Some of those who came to San Francisco in the 19th century were quite unsuccessful in fulfilling their dreams. Joshua Abraham Norton was one of those, a man who came here, attempted to corner the market in rice, failed to do that, lost his small fortune, and in the consequence of that, lost his mind. He began calling himself Emperor Norton. He was wearing an elaborate outfit, a great ostrich-plumed hat, a frock coat with gold braid. He carried a big gold sword wherever he went.
He is a harmless creature who is up early and late, regulating the affairs of the world in general and the city and state in particular. Samuel Williams, 1875.
Didn't have any money, but the people of San Francisco humored him as if he were an unofficial city mascot. They allowed him to issue checks on his imperial treasury to pay for meals in some of the city's finest restaurants.
Emperor Norton died suddenly in 1880 of apoplexy. The city of San Francisco paid for his funeral, and over 10,000 people attended the ceremony to pay their last respects. San Francisco had grown to a city of 350,000 and was second only to New York in foreign and domestic trade. By the opening of the 1890s, San Francisco utterly dominated the West. But an unexpected disaster shortly after the turn of the century would change the city forever.
Hey. Matt, got your email. Vancouver? Genius. Passed it on to Epps. He's running it through the Northwest.
Hey, Matt. Ideas a hit in the Northwest. I've got purchasing checking suppliers.
You want it up top. Client briefing. Your Vancouver idea.
Want to take your business to the next level?
Athlete's foot. It's a predator made up of many types of fungus that eat your feet alive. But there's a potent weapon that doesn't just cure some, it kills them all. Lotrimin AF, the killer cure. Lotrimin AF, the brand doctors recommend most. Full prescription strength medicine, Lotrimin AF is so powerful, it doesn't just kill some causes, it kills them all. Lotrimin AF, the killer cure.
It starts here. It starts here. It also starts here and here. And it all starts right here at Walmart, home of the EverStart battery. All the coal-cranking power your truck, car, boat, or more will ever need. Power you can count on when you need it most. And since it's at Walmart, you can also count on a good price. EverStart. The name says it all.
If I could fall asleep right now, I'd get 6 good hours. I could still get 4 hours. 4 hours is okay. I've done without sleep before. I can do it again.
If you can't sleep, if things you've tried leave you groggy the next day, your doctor has a breakthrough approach to sleep therapy you should know about. Sleep Solutions from Searle.
Tonight on the History Channel. Tonight on the History Channel. Tonight on the History Channel.
Tonight at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific, In Search of History tracks the abominable snowman. Then witness the white walls of death, avalanches on an all-new Wrath of God. Then who reached the peak of Mount Everest first, Hillary or Tenzing? Find out on an all-new History Undercover.
Gather your families. Tonight on the History Channel.
The last major European battle of the Second World War.
As long as he can fight, they'll attack.
Henry Fonda, Charles Bronson, and Telly Savalas. Movies in Time.
We thought the war was almost over. The Germans proved otherwise.
Presents Battle of the Bulge. Tomorrow at 9 Eastern, 10 Pacific on the History Channel.
We now return to San Francisco.
Death and destruction have been the fate of San Francisco. Scourged by flames that rage diametrically in all directions, the city is a mass of smoldering ruins. The Call Chronicle Examiner, April 19, 1906.
The 1906 earthquake and fire was one of the most devastating disasters in the history of the American West. The people of San Francisco were awakened on April 18th, 1906, a little after 5 o'clock, by this incredible roar. It was an ear-splitting, deafening sound rising deep from in the earth. For 45 seconds, the ground beneath San Francisco was in convulsions. Then there was a 10 or 12-second interval, and 25 seconds more of shaking. Buildings collapsed, sidewalks buckled in grotesque shapes, great gaping fissures opened in the surface. In the south of Market area, the land there, much of which was fill, began undulating in sickening waves 2 or 3 feet in height, bringing down everything above it.
Within an hour of the devastation of the earthquake, more than 100 fires began burning throughout the city. These blazes began to join into an enormous firestorm which reached 2,000 degrees, scorching the earth of the city. The fire department put up a heroic battle to try and contain the flames, but it was useless. The water mains were broken.
For 3 days and 2 nights, the fire burned virtually unchecked. It was stopped only when the fire department was able to destroy a huge swath of homes along Van Ness Avenue, creating a great fire break, and there the fire was stopped.
490 blocks were destroyed, 4 square miles, and over 28,000 buildings had been leveled in the fire.
As the reporter goes to press, San Francisco and the entire state face one of the worst calamities that has ever visited the coast. But the ruin that is following from the fires that have been started as a result of the awful shock is appalling and unprecedented. Berkeley Reporter, April 18, 1906.
Probably as many as 3,000 people lost their lives in the earthquake and the fire. The recovery efforts began almost immediately after the fire and the earthquake.
Although thousands of people fled the city by train, most San Franciscans stuck it out. This kind of devastation may have silenced other cities and left them in disarray, but the earthquake and fire of 1906 unified the people of San Francisco.
The mayor, Eugene Schmitz, who was soon to be under indictment for a variety of crimes, actually acquitted himself very well in the aftermath of the disaster, restoring law and order.
Mayor Schmitz appointed his political enemy, ex-mayor James Phelan, to head a committee of 50 to plan relief and recovery. 200,000 homeless camped in tents around the city. Soup kitchens were hastily set up in the ruins and took the names of fallen restaurants of the city.
After the earthquake and fire in 1906, San Francisco business leaders, elected politicians, all joined together to reestablish San Francisco in its role as the preeminent urban settlement in the Pacific Coast.
But many feared that this great disaster may have shown the rest of the world that San Francisco was too vulnerable to keep control of the West.
The earthquake advertised to the rest of the world that if you're going to do business or live in San Francisco, you risk being swallowed up by an earthquake. But at the same time, the earthquake and fire contributed to a sense of, well, we can't do anything about the earthquake and the fires, but we can show the rest of the world that we're not going to let this get us down. So a sense of optimism, a sense of we're going to beat the odds, a sense that nothing can stand in the way of our putting back together San Francisco even better than it was before, also followed the earthquake and fire.
But San Francisco was not left alone to deal with its devastation. Congress quickly voted $2 million for immediate relief, and individual states and foreign countries sent another $9 million in food and money to the city.
The city, of course, still points with pride to its recovery from that disaster. If you look on the official seal of the city of San Francisco, you see there a symbol of that recovery, of course, which is the phoenix rising from the flames.
The people of San Francisco were confident that their city would once again become the giant of the West Coast.
Dear President Roosevelt, the people of San Francisco have shown a remarkable courage in the hours of this great calamity. Within the next 5 years, we will return to the nation her greatest seaport on her western shores. Mayor Eugene Schmitz, 1906.
The initial prosperity of San Francisco was similar to that of countless boomtowns throughout the West. Fortune hunters, entrepreneurs, and outlaws flooded cities in search of instant wealth. But most towns were quickly deserted after the easy money ran out, leaving only skeletons where bustling societies once flourished. Had it not been for the spirit and character of the people of San Francisco, the city by the bay may have suffered the same fate. Through adversity and prosperity, the people of San Francisco succeeded in creating a rich, diverse, and long-lasting legacy.
Now, from the History Channel, you can own the best of the real West with Kenny Rogers. Call 1-800-708-1776 and order this collector's edition 5-video cassette box set for $79.95 plus shipping and handling. These true stories of the heroes and villains of the Old West come alive in this award-winning series, The Best of the Real West with Kenny Rogers. Call now, 1-800-708-1776.
Coming up next, it's the colorful history of the trolley on High Points in History. Then air combat takes to the skies on Vietnam, combat from the cockpit. And later tonight, In Search of History tracks the abominable snowman at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific.